QSO Today, episode 261, Philip Lazar, K9PL. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you that they have just the right rig for contesters, DXers, and rag chewers. And by QRP Labs, my friend Hans Summers, G0 UPL's kit company, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver. My thanks to ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. A number of episodes ago, I expressed a desire to build a CW practice communication system to use over my Wi-Fi with my grandson. A number of you replied with comments and useful suggestions. One of you sent me a link to the K9YI Telegraph with an article on the K1EL Morse code tutor keyer, written by my guest today, Philip Lazar, K9PL. The K9YA Telegraph is a monthly newsletter now edited by Philip Lazar. It is a wonderful ham radio read, easy to print and share. Links to it will be in this episode's show notes page. K9PL, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Philip?
K9PL here, Eric.
Philip, thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it started for me as an SWL. When I was in elementary school, there was a fad for Helicrafters S38s. Several boys in the class had them. There was a lot of talk about them in class. I was curious. I used to receive National Geographic magazine. At the time, they had an offer for recording of shortwave snippets. I had the recording narrated by Alex Dreyer, a newsman and narrator, and I got a night kit Spanmaster kit, and I built that. It was a 2-tube super regenerative receiver, and with it I was able to listen to broadcast band and some amateur transmissions. From there, while wandering around one of my uncle's basements, I found an old Helicrafters full of cobwebs. I spoke to him about it, and it wound up it was a 1937 Helicrafters SX9. It had not been turned on in decades, and he gave it to me. And that was the receiver I learned to copy code on. And
can we go back just a second? I want to go back a second. You mentioned that you got a recording from National Geographic magazine, and perhaps only the oldest listeners of the QSO Today podcast may remember that National Geographic often had recordings essentially look like 45 RPM records, paper thin in their magazine. Is that where you got this recording?
No, this was from Helicrafters itself. Helicrafters was headquartered in Chicago, and it was 50 cents, and it was something like there's Adventure in Shortwave Radio, and it had snippets of amateur transmissions, ship-to-shore transmissions, newscasts, and a local newsman was Alex Dreyer, and he was the one who narrated it. And I think a lot of people have it. The recording's available online. You search for Helicrafters recording, you can listen to it.
I'll put a link to that in the show notes page then.
Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, so you were saying that you have this Helicrafters SX9. You learned CW listening to the SX9. So how did it go on from there?
From there, I was a shortwave listener for many years. I did not get my license at that point. Many years later, my father suggested I follow the tradition of his nephew, who had been licensed in the 1930s, and get my amateur license. And I did. I did not have an Elmer. I bought all the available study guides at the time from the League, from Tab Books, from Amico, and I learned code via tapes, LPs, and listening to on-air transmissions. And the SX9 was located in the basement with just a 20-foot piece of wire strung along the floor, but at the time it was good enough to pick up marine broadcasts and news bulletins and amateur transmissions, and that's where I learned to copy code or to improve my speed.
What year did you get your first license?
I took my exam in downtown Chicago with the FCC in 1976, in December of 1976, but it did not arrive in the mail until sometime in late January 1977. So I counted from 1977.
And what was the call sign?
My call sign, I was licensed originally as a general. My call sign was WD9ADE, Whiskey Delta Niner, Alpha Delta Echo. That license was good for about 9 months until I got my advanced, and then another 9 months or so later, I got my extra. My extra call sign was AA9N, a 2x1, one of the original 2x1s, Alpha Niner, November. And in 1999, because I was never really comfortable with a 2x1 call, I applied for a vanity call with my initials, K9PL.
And why do you think you weren't comfortable with a AA call?
It may be because I'm a traditionalist, because growing up all the calls were W9s and Ks and WA9s, WB9s, WD9s, and I just wasn't very comfortable with it. It didn't look like an amateur call sign to me. Of course it is, and after I let go of that call sign, it was snapped up almost immediately by somebody else because it's a very short call sign on Morse.
Right, excellent for CW. Well, the truth be told, I also hold on to my WA6 for the same reason, I think. What was your first rig after getting this general class license in 1977? How did you get on the air?
My first rig was a DX35 Heathkit used one. Obviously, it was an old rig when I got it. It was not a great rig for the apartment I lived in at that time. It was too big and too much power, and I was getting into TV sets in the building, including my own. So my next rig following that was a Ten-Tech Argonaut 509, which was 5 watts or less, I think considerably less than 5 watts. And being in an apartment, I was limited as far as antennas went, but I did have a west wall in my apartment that was approximately 40 feet long, and that wall was lined with windows. The windows had aluminum storm windows in them, and I jumpered every one of those windows together and tuned them with an LC tuner and had effectively 40-foot long or so random wire antenna. And despite running QRP, the solar cycle was so good. I worked 86 countries on that antenna and that rig. So it took several more years to acquire the 14 more I needed for my 100 countries, my Century DXCC. But I was amazed at the amount of DX I could work with that QRP rig, to the point where every dusk I was working any number of Japanese stations on 15 meters. As many as I could hear, I could work.
Well, I think in those days, making a commitment to the Ten-Tech Argonaut was really making a commitment to QRP. There weren't a lot of QRP radios out in those days. Is that what you did? Have you become a lover of QRP ever since?
I'm QRO and QRP, and my QRO is 100 watts. But yes, I built, I must have 10 or 12 QRP kits I built in the intervening years, in addition to my big rigs in the shack. And my most recent QRP rigs are 2 of the QRP Labs QCX rigs, a 40-meter version and a 20-meter version. They're amazing devices for their size and their cost. They're a bit complex to build, but they have remarkable performance and offer a remarkable range of options through a menu. There'll be a more advanced rig coming out shortly, introduced by Hans Sommer. There'll be the QSX. It'll run more power and be multi-band. Most people with QCXs, I think, are waiting eagerly for that rig to be released.
Well, and I am one of them. QRP Labs is a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast, and we've talked about the QCX a lot of times. Do you recommend the QCX as a transceiver for a beginner? Should it be a first rig?
I would say that it would be a good learning experience for someone with a great deal of patience, considering the current state of propagation. But I think it would be a good instructional kit, and when the propagation guide's permitting, you'll have great QSOs. I know on the 20-meter one I built, my first QSO was to Central America, and conditions were very, very poor. I had to wait 2 weeks with no QSOs after I first built it. It was that bad, but I heard this Central American station, I believe it was in Nicaragua, and he came back to me on the first call. He gave me a 579. He was 599 here on a fan dipole. So the antenna was not a gain dipole, rather a gain antenna, and I was running on 20 meters. That rig runs 3.2 watts. The 40-meter version runs 4.9 watts, which is about average for those rigs.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Do you take that rig out into the field? Are you a field operator?
No, I'm not. I've used my PF3 in the backyard here with a portable vertical with the Pacific antennas vertical, but that's as much of hamming outdoors that I do, aside from field day.
At the time that you licensed, you had the opportunity, the obvious opportunity to be a single sideband operator. Why did you stick with CW even after you had the ability to have voice privileges?
I think it was a sense of personal accomplishment. Like many in those days, I wasn't sure I'd be able to learn the code or be able to learn the code proficiently. And one of the reasons I started with the general was I figured, well, once I get on the air, I can use sideband, and I won't have to bother with CW anymore. But using, first of all, starting with the DX35, which I used only for a very short time, then gave it to someone else who needed a rig. I was stuck gladly on QRP, and that was the way to go. It was with CW, and the more I used it, the more proficient I became, to the point where I had no desire to get on sideband. I have very, very rarely in my ham career gotten on sideband. There was a period early on with friends where I ran RIDI at their station, and slow scan television and sideband, and even some AM. But at my own station, 99% CW.
Well, it appears to me that, okay, so CW is your favorite operating mode. It seems to me that you're a member of a bunch of operator clubs around CW, like I think A1 Operators Club, FISTS, SKCC. You can tell me what those are. NAQCC.
Well, the Straight Key Century Club is SKCC.
Okay.
It's a wonderful organization. They have over 21,000 members now. They have weekly events. Great group, very polite. Not a high-speed club on the air. At least I'm sure many of the members are high-speed operators. But it's a very welcoming club, and the events are very low-key. They're very laid back and fun to participate in. FIST, of course, which I believe is one of the oldest CW organizations. I've been a member of there for quite a while. And North American QRP Club, NAQCC. I've been a member of that for many years. And they also run many events, and a very pleasant group, very polite operators and courteous. A1 Operator Club is an ARRL sponsored entity there. You have to be sponsored by two existing members to receive the certificate, and it has to do with your professionalism or behavior or whatever on the air. And it's done anonymously. I don't know who nominated me, but two individuals nominated me, and several years ago I received it in the mail and was very surprised and pleased.
Now, you also belong to CW Ops. Are you a teacher for any of these organizations? Do you help other people learn the code?
I have had people learn code, but not through the group. I've had people ask me, and I've gotten on the air with them on a weekly basis, and we send code back and forth to each other. I am a member of CW Ops. I was nominated, and I accepted it. When I was first licensed, I assisted in teaching Morse to a club. We had a weekly Morse net. The members the groups were all novices or beginning generals. And my friend was teaching them theory. He was an electronics engineer for the FAA, and I taught them Morse, and we got in the air and practiced Morse. And as I mentioned, since then I've assisted several people to learn Morse.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. Now that field day has passed, we enter the contest season and hopefully more time to get on the air. It's time to get the ICOM transceiver that's best suited for your lifestyle. ICOM offers a variety of high-performance and innovative products. Make the most of the summer and contest season with one of these great ICOM rigs. The IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants, and just in time for contest season. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The new ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio, SDR, that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. The ICOM 7610 features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receivers, and dual digicell. The IC7300 has changed the way an entry-level HF transceiver is designed. The rig is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed your expectations. I purchased one myself last fall and can tell you that the ICOM 7300 is as good or better than any rig I've ever had. The ICOM IC 7300 includes RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, internal antenna tuner, and an SD card memory slot. No matter which ICOM rig you choose, you'll be a winner. Be sure to check out these fine rigs at www.icomamerica.com or click on the banner on the QSO Today show notes page. And when you finally go to make your ICOM purchase, be sure to tell the dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO. Can I ask you a hypothetical question? Perhaps you run into a ham who's been licensed for 45 years and hasn't been on CW in 44 years. What advice would you have for a guy like that?
Well, I don't think it's all that uncommon. I occasionally work somebody who was licensed for quite a while, and they'll mention that they just got back on the air, period, or they just got back into CW, and work slow. I work slow with them, or I work at their pace. The other thing I would suggest for somebody like that would be to join one of the groups. A lot of those groups have they'll sign you a code Elmer or a code buddy. FISH has that. SKC, I believe, has that. Just to check any of those groups' websites, they'll give you the information. You may have a local ham who can Elmer you. And maybe just listen for a while. I know when I was first licensed, although I had a general class license, I did not operate, for the most part, in the general sub-bands. I operated in novice bands because I wanted to get my code speed up. I wanted to become proficient in code protocol, and learned all the Q signals and the abbreviations and procedures before I jumped in with the practice, CW ops. So, and at the time with the novice sub-bands, it was a great place because everybody was a tyro, and mistakes were forgiven or not noticed. People were working slowly, and it was a great place. And it's sort of a sad state that the novice license, as it was, is no longer offered because I think it attracted a lot of young people. In that period, in the late 70s, early 80s, I worked many, many young people, and I was myself young at the time. But these were teenagers or early 20s in the sub-bands, and many women, too, which there seemed to be fewer and fewer women, at least on CW, than there was. And those two subsets of amateurs seem to be in fewer in number in the last 40 years.
Well, I think you're episode 261, Philip, and I think that I've come to the conclusion after 260 episodes of the QSO Today podcast that I, too, think the novice license was an amazingly valuable thing for amateur radio in terms of bringing in the kids. It was a great place to start and a great place to find mentors and a great place to kind of bridge the gap between generations, don't you think?
Yes, I do. I believe it was. There is, unfortunately, it has nothing to do with society or politics or anything else. Its technology has changed to the point where it is no longer amazing, and I'm not the first one to say this, it is no longer amazing to be able to talk around the world, communicate around the world from your desk. I mean, now it can be done from a smartphone or any type of phone out of your pocket. That was very remarkably noticeable in the late 70s, again, early 80s into the mid-80s with auto patch on 2 meters, where families were being licensed just to be able to utilize the auto patch on the local repeater. And all these personal phone calls were being made. And once cell phones became cheap and popular and appliances, that traffic disappeared. And at least in this area, in the Chicago metropolitan area, I can scan the repeaters which at one time you'd have to wait in line to get onto, and they are devoid of traffic. There is a small bit of simplex, and that's about all I hear on there.
I have a UHF All-Star node, which is a repeater that's connected to the All-Star network. And I connect often to the WIN system in California because it has 90 other connections to it on the average, maybe more some days, maybe less some days, just to have almost the same amount of traffic as a single repeater in Los Angeles in the 1970s. So
yes.
It's where we are.
Yeah, well, it's again, it's the technology. Technology's put the world into the hands of anybody who has a cell phone or a computer. I mean, the fact that we can send a K9YA telegraph around the world instantaneously, postage free, is significant and very important, and certainly makes the literary part of amateur radio available to any amateur who wants to do what used to be, basement newsletter printing. I started 30 some odd years ago in business newsletters for an international consulting firm, and we were competing with people who were printing newsletters literally in their basement. And so this now can be done from desktop publishing, and you can send your newsletter around the world in an instant. And we have, at least at the K9YA Telegraph, which is the brainchild of Mike Dinelli, N9DOR, for the past 16 years, we've been publishing club newsletter, and we have subscribers in over 100 countries. Our contributors, including our wonderful cartoonist, Jeff Murray, K1NSS, come from our readership. I write the monthly lead column or article, and all the rest of the articles in that newsletter, and we have a 53-page index at this point after 16 years, come from our readership. So we have a wonderful readership with many and varied interests, and decades to hundreds of thousands of years on the air cumulatively. And we also have a Facebook page at the K9YA Telegraph, and we're giving back to amateur radio, we hope, all that we've received in the decades we've been hands. And that goes for me and Mike and Jeff and all the contributors to the newsletter.
So let's back up just a little bit, okay? Because I just want to make sure I get the whole story. And that is, as you were interested in electronics and radio, you were a shortwave listener as a teenager. Did that influence what you did for a living? Where you went to school, what you did afterwards?
Well, no. It only as far as communications is concerned. A degree in mass communication, a degree in speech, and I made my living writing and editing, primarily for an international consulting firm as the senior automotive editor. And that was an interesting job with a lot of travel. And later on in a business with a partner in corporate relocation, newsletters on corporate, actually a magazine in corporate relocation. And so just the communications parts of radio, and the fact that I was interested in mechanical things and electronics things. And I went through the baby boomers were an interesting group: model railroading, model aircraft, radio control aircraft, chemistry, rocket building, hands-on sorts of things. Pardon?
I said hot rods, cars.
Well, you guessed what I was going to say. Doing tune-ups on weekends, and a lot of it. Yes, hot rods, installing dual exhausts and cams and carbs and sports cars. Actually, my first work as a newsletter editor in my 20s. I was the editor of the Austin Healey Club of America, a newsletter called The Chatter. I drove an MG at the time, but I wrote the Austin Healey newsletter. And I was also a member of the Triumph Owners Club Association of America, and a member of the MG Car Club, which was based in England, and I was an overseas member. So, this was sort of a baby boomer thing, which is also indicative of where amateur radio is going. I think a lot of the hands-on hobbies, pastimes, and pursuits have aged along with their participants. If you look at photographs online of individuals into model railroading and radio control aircraft, or any hobby that requires skill, money, and experience, it's an aging group. I'm not sure where they're recruiting from. And in time, it'll evolve into something else, I imagine. But
or it won't, right? I said it either will evolve into something else or it just won't. Like a model railroading, for example.
It may. Model railroading, and I have a great deal of interest in that. And I do not currently have a lab, but I've built a lot of model railroading equipment and rolling stock and locomotives. structures is become an expensive pastime, but very advanced with sound and action and extreme detail. And the prices, I think, are probably pretty much, although they seem expensive now, I think they're pretty much commensurate with the locomotives and rolling stock of the brass period, where everybody wanted to get a brass locomotive. So, but again, that's an aging population too, at least from what I see online. I know, I don't belong to any model railroading clubs, but that's what it appears like, and it also appears like that with radio control aircraft. I think the drones attract a younger group or a more eclectic group.
Who is the audience for the K9YA telegraph?
Well, we haven't done a survey, but I think it is a rather broad spectrum or broad demographic. We have people, at least going by the messages we receive and the articles submitted, who are relatively new to amateur radio, and those who have been amateur radio operators for decades. I think that we tend toward CW operators, but not excluding people who are interested in other modes. And many of our authors dabble in many modes and have written articles about many modes of operation. But I would say I wouldn't want to draw conclusions. It's very difficult to say because, as I mentioned, we have over subscribers in more than 100 countries in Asia, Europe, the Antipodes, North America, Central and South America. So it's difficult to make a blanket statement about who our subscribers are unless we ran a survey.
How do you decide the subject of an article that you might write for the K9YA Telegraph?
I draw from a couple of sources. The first source being myself and my experiences on the air. Matter of fact, my September article in the September issue is one like that. Other ones have to do with curiosity. I'll be curious about some topic and start doing research and find the amateur radio angle on it and write about that. I also read vintage magazines online and my own collection of vintage magazines and see where they lead to. Sometimes I'll be reading something that has absolutely nothing to do with amateur radio, and amateur radio is mentioned, or communications are mentioned. And when I do the research and dive a bit deeper into it, I find that especially those in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, amateur radio was involved, especially in exploration, especially in various record attempts where governmental or commercial broadcasting or radio services weren't available. Amateur radio was the go-to. So amateur radio, from my writing now in the last 16 years, amateur radio was integral to at least the early part of the 20th century, up and through, I'd say, the 1960s. Amateur radio was integral to a lot of advances in science and exploration. So, and I think it's an unexplored, for the most part, or forgotten part of amateur radio history.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder, or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. Well, you wrote a series of articles based on the radio articles that appeared in the very early editions of Boys Life magazine. How did that get triggered, and what did you discover from that?
Well, that came from, and that's going way back, if that's the same article you're thinking you are. I was researching Zay Book at W2PI, who was an amateur radio author, an amateur radio advocate, a short story writer for pulp magazines, and also wrote a lot of self-help books on radio. Teach yourself radio repair, teach yourself, electronics sort of things. And I found out that he had written a column in the 1920s for radio for Boys Life magazine. So I went online and found a cache of old Boys Life and read his columns, and he was all over the place. He was aboard some premier flights to in the Caribbean, and he was quite a guy. He passed away in his 40s, and he's another person who wasn't well remembered until I started reading about him. He was quite a celebrity, amateur radio operator and journalist in the 30s and 40s, but it seemed like in the intervening decades he's been forgotten.
What was the response that you got from those articles?
Somebody offered to sell me one of his books. That was the response. It was one of his Learn How to Repair Radio books, and it was offered to. Well,
I think you've come to a remarkable conclusion about the contribution of amateur radio to the development of technology through the 60s. Do you think that's from all of the research that you've done? Because you do a number of historical articles a year.
Yes, I like to do a mix of product reviews, kit reviews, personal experiences, and historical articles. And history is just one of my interests, just history in general. I mean, when I was writing the Austin Healey Club newsletter, I had a great deal of interest in the history of British automobiles, and so I did a lot of research on that at the time and wrote articles in the newsletter about British sports cars and the history of British sports cars. And in radio, that again was my interest, more broadly in history and specifically amateur radio. And the bird expeditions, amateur radio was very heavily involved. Original around-the-world flights, aside from including Amelia Earhart, her flight, amateur radio was involved. And Howard Hughes, amateur radio was involved in his around-the-world flight. In a lecture also, of course, his flight had a better result and a happier ending. But amateur radio was integral to both those flights also. So it's hard to separate mid-20th century science and exploration from amateur radio.
Well, for those listeners who are not listening, who haven't listened yet to episode 259 of the QSO Today podcast, I think that with the creation of the digital modes, we're seeing that merging again of science and ham radio. Have you heard anything about that?
No, but I'm familiar with the digital modes. I don't practice them, but I read about them online. I read about them in forums, and I did download. I use Mac, and Mac doesn't have quite the panoply of available programs. But I did download a decoder, and I was copying PSK for quite a while. It reminded me when I did RIDI, and I didn't have any particular interest in it, but I was glad I was able to decode it, and so that was fun watching it appear on the screen. But I just tend to stick with CW. I mean, I noticed this year, starting in January, I have had probably close to 1,000 QSOs on CW, and a lot of it were short QSOs, thanks to SKCC, NAQCC, and FIS. So some of them were some of them were reactues, some of them were just short number exchanges. But it keeps me on the air, keeps my fingers flexible, and it keeps the capacitors formed in the rig. I currently use a 1999 vintage Yaesu FT1000 MP, and I also have a Yaesu FT840. That's the extent of my QRO rigs, and I have an FT2500 FM monobander. And my one, I bow to a new technology. I have a B-Tech tribander, 220, 2 meters, and 440 handheld, which is a really nice rig for $45. I listen to FM radio primarily.
Yes, it is. I said unless you take it downtown.
Yeah, I didn't take it downtown. It's really a remarkable little device, and as I say, though, I guess I'm as guilty as anyone else, not getting on 2 meters and using it, aside from checking out that it does work on 2 meters. A further note on 2 meters, I used to use it a lot on simplex. When propagation was better, a few local hams would stay tuned to 143.5 5.35, right? 535. And if we'd heard DX, we'd get on there and do some reporting and see if we could work the DX. With the paucity of DX now, we could be monitoring that channel or their frequency for weeks and not get a response. So, and I noticed also we used to have a DX repeater in this area, and I haven't heard much on there. I'm not even sure if that repeater is still active. So,
what's the Rod Newkirk collection?
The Rod Newkirk collection is an anthology of Rod Newkirk's articles written for the K9 by Telegraph for over a number of years, and we collected it. I wrote the foreword to it, and we published it on Lulu. It's sold at nonprofit. Anything the K9YAS Telegraph prints or publishes is nonprofit. We have nothing to do with the financial side of it. It's whatever Lulu charges, that's it. We just gave Lulu the manuscript. They print it, that's it. And we also publish Pierpont's The Art and Skill of Radio Telegraphy in a revised edition with a greatly revised index, photographs, and added bonuses. And again, that's available through Lulu. So we were very pleased to have Rod write for us, being an amateur radio legend, writing for many years for QST as he did, a wonderful gentleman. His daughter, I had the pleasure of being the volunteer examiner for her technician, general, and extra class licenses. And Mike Donnelly, the N9BOR, who's also a volunteer examiner. He was another one of the examiners. We had the pleasure of proctoring her exams. And so the Newkirk tradition of amateur radio continues through her and through her brother, who's also a AM. And we also had the pleasure of publishing perhaps the last 2 or 3 articles of Wayne Green, W2NSD, just about a year or so before his passing. So we've had all our authors are great. Some are legendary.
Now, why was that? Was 73 magazine no longer being published when you published Wayne Green?
The Wayne Green came about for some reason. Either he contacted me or I contacted him, and I think he contacted me because of something we published. And I was surprised and pleased and amazed that that I received an email from him, and I suggested that he write something for us, and he asked what, and I said, something of your experience, your long experience as an amateur, and he came back, as I mentioned, 2 or 3 articles, and we published them, and unfortunately, he too became a silent key about a year later. What the great thing about him was, and I don't know how instrumental he was in occurring, but the fact that all those magazines, 73 magazines, are available online. So all those articles and his editorials are available. I made I wrote a couple articles on the connection between UFOs and amateur radio, and there's quite a plethora of information about it. I was surprised to find so much in the government record and in magazines, amateur radio magazines, about links between amateur radio and unidentified flying objects. And I used 1 or 2 of his editorials, or quoted from 1 or 2 of his editorials about UFOs. And he was a believer, I believe. He was a believer, I think, based on his editorials. He has a rather unique idea about how they were propelled and what dimension they came from, or other than just being what they appeared to.
Well, he was a person for a lot of audiences, I think. I enjoyed reading 73 magazine as a kid.
Yeah, I subscribed to it also, and all the way to the end when they became rather sporadic. And I waited long periods between issues, as I recall, or they would fail to deliver magazines at all, but until I would call or write to them about it.
Now, you mentioned that you've built the QCX transceiver kit. That means you must have an electronics workbench. What's the project on the workbench today?
Well, the project on the workbench is I want to replace I want to put a 3-line cord into the FT101 I have here, which looks almost unused, and there's no room on my operating desk for it to use as a regular rig. But in case it is used as a regular rig, I want to install a 3-line cord in it, and I also want to replace the infamous burnout resistor in the FT840 with a higher wattage resistor. I have the resistor, I just have to insert it in the 840, and I have the cord for the FT101. I also have the safety caps, the line safety caps, if I want to install those, and have suspenders and a belt on that rig. So those are the two projects now. I'm awaiting the release of the QSX from QRP Labs. I just about weekly look for kits to build online, and I just haven't found anything for a while that attracts me. But certainly, when I get a chance to find something, I'd like to build something. But there's no kits on the desk.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. Now, you like kits as a way of... I too like kits because all the parts are in one bag. I don't have to go searching for them. But do you like kits primarily as a way of building?
Yes. I've homebrewed some things, some simple things, but I like the kits because even after 40 years as a ham, especially on transceivers or receivers, and the first time you turn them on, if they don't blow off the magical smoke, and the first signal you hear is still a miracle. It's just amazing. I know when they built the first QCX, the 40-meter version, and I turned it on, and it was in the 40-meter CW, American CW subband, and was luckily tuned to the signal there, and I heard somebody sending code, and I was just amazed. It was miraculous, almost like a pre-1920s crystal set, and actually hearing something out of the air. It's always an amazement. And I must have built 12 or 15 QRP rigs since the newsletter's been published, and it's always a miracle, the first signal I hear on them.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, and it's almost secondary to working. To working another station. The big thrill is hearing the first signal. And if you're hearing the first signal, for the most part, you're going to be able to make QSOs with. So it's still magic.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
I say minimal. It has not impacted my life with significant others. It had no effect whatsoever on my immediate family, except that I was the uncle or the brother who was a ham. They display no interest in it, and I guess I was the one who was born to the amateur radio genes in the immediate generation, or their generation. I've tried to introduce my nieces and nephews to it. The only curiosity was, why does your clock say 1700 on it, or the equivalent, and explain the 24-hour clock to them, and that's about as far as it goes. So, you may have read the article I wrote a couple of years ago about being, our ham radio operators born or made. And there was a little bit of debate about that I've seen online about that article. And I still stick to my guns. I think you're born with an innate curiosity about radio and wonder about radio, and communicating out of thin air with equipment that you either built or have sitting in front of you with a wire up in the air that you stuck up in the air. And I think it's akin to abilities in mathematics and music. I don't think you can force somebody to enjoy amateur radio. You may be able to force somebody to get their license. I don't think you can force them to get on the air. And I've seen some proof of that as a volunteer examiner. I've given exams to many, many technicians who have not advanced from technician as far as I know, nor have they ever gotten on the air, aside from maybe once or twice with an HT.
Well, do you think that's a problem with the clubs themselves who aren't pursuing those people and bringing them in, or do you think that the clubs have done everything they can in order to get those people interested?
Well, I don't know. I can only speak from personal experience on that. I have belonged to several clubs in the years I've been a ham. They did not pursue members. The members pursued the clubs. They would learn about the clubs either, I guess, through QST or something I don't see anymore is ads, just a little typewriter, 8.5 by 11 posters stuck in windows of electronic stores. Well, there's fewer and fewer electronic stores. I know I lived about 2 blocks from the local Heathkit store, and they had those kinds of posters in the window about local amateur radio clubs. So if you're interested in Heathkit, you might be interested in the amateur radio. Therefore, you might be interested in a club. And with the dearth of no more Heathkit stores and the dearth of electronic stores, it becomes more difficult to learn about local clubs. And I know the first local club I joined right after earning my license, I was returning home, walking from shopping, and in the parking lot I saw a Cadillac with amateur radio plates on it, a new Cadillac, and a very dapper-looking gentleman was getting into the car, and I said, "Oh, you have amateur plates?" He said, "Yeah, are you a ham?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, "I just received my license in the mail that day." He said, "Well, there's a ham radio meeting tonight at a local bowling alley," which was another couple blocks further on. And I said, "Yeah, I'll see you tonight at the club meeting." And I made great friends in that club and was a member of that club for 20 or 30 years. And it changes, several changes of venue. So it's just a societal change, I think, that it's difficult perhaps to get for people to know. And if you don't really want an amateur radio license, but you got an amateur radio license because you're enrolled in a STEM class or because your job demands it, I don't think you're going to pursue joining a club and the investment of time and perhaps money it takes to do that.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
What excites me about it is the return, thanks to clubs like SKCC and NAQCC and FIS, to operators who have been off the air for a number of years. I think also the introduction of digital modes, although I know sometimes the digital mode operators seem to be unaware of other operators on the air. I know especially down in the CW subbands, they pop up. But the nice thing about the rigs are they have tuning dials on them. And in my experience, I've just tuned away when somebody pops up. And it's not worth the irritation. There's still enough spectrum available where you can tune away from QRM. And so the part of the activity of these non-for-profit groups, I think it's very exciting and positive. I think the inclusion of these new digital modes is exciting and positive, too. I'm not familiar with DMR, but I know there's been a reawakening of interest in VHF and UHF through DMR. And I have positive thoughts about amateur radio. It is slowly evolving. I don't know what it'll be like in 50 or 100 years, but I think there will be some form of amateur radio in 50 or 100. People who sail brigs and brigantines or recreate Amelia Earhart's flight in a Lockheed Electra. We'll be doing replicas and 100 years from now, whatever our most advanced rig is, our ICOM 7610 or FT101D, somebody be building a replica or salvaging one from somewhere and getting back on the air with it. So I think that amateur radio is much like model railroading. I think in that it requires skill, it requires practice, it requires knowledge, and you have to. And for somebody who's really into amateur radio, it requires it's a multi-mode pastime service, electronics, building, operations, learning the rules and regulations, and adhering to them, extracurricular activities, meeting with hands out off the air and meeting them for lunch and dinners and various things, the social side of it. And the same thing applied to model railroading, electrical work, carpentry, scenery, building kits. So these are very involving pastimes, and it's being a jack of all trades. I think they're very rewarding hobbies. And of course, with amateur radio, it also serves as a service to the nation in times of need, and as a reservoir of, as we say in Part 97, a trained operator.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Same thing I give to new hams. Get out of the air. I mean, I've been writing that and saying, I wrote a couple articles for EHAM website before the newsletter started, and just to get on the air, you just have to break the ice. When I first got my license, my first QSOs, I sweated my shirt through. You know, I still have the first QSL card I received from 1978, and I literally sweated my shirt through with fear, CW fear, and after a while, it becomes second nature. You get in, it becomes like speaking. It's a nonverbal form of communications, and I'll say mic fright. You know, I'm not real crazy about operating on sideband because I guess I get some mic fright, but you just do it. I'm sure if I was on sideband more, I would enjoy it more. So get on the air, break the ice, and don't be afraid of people thinking you're a lid. People make mistakes. When I listen to the high-speed operators at the bottom of the bands, I hear them making mistakes. I may not hear them making mistakes at 60 words per minute, but I hear them making mistakes just as I make mistakes at 35 words a minute or something if I'm operating at higher speeds. There are low speeds. Don't be afraid to do it, because the more errors you make, the fewer you'll make later on. And nobody's perfect, and people are much more accepting of novices or newbies or retreads than novices and retreads think they are.
What's your favorite keyer? What keyer do you have, and why?
When I work members of SKCC, I use a straight key, usually a J37, a J38, or I also have what's the other one I have? A SpeedX straight key. And at this point on the desk, I have a J37. I like the J37. It maintains its settings, and it has a certain springiness built into it to counter and yet rigidity. It's really reassuring and comfortable for me. As far as a keyer, I have a Logic keyer, and I use a bencher, an original bencher, the one with the flying springs, the ones that the spring is not attached to firmly. And that's the original run, the taper sticker on it. I've built several other keyers. Yes, I built a couple other keyers, and I also have an MFG keyer, but I prefer the Logic keyer at this point, the Logic. And I like the bencher, although I have some other paddles, but I prefer the bencher.
Well, Philip, you've been a wonderful guest. I really appreciate your coming on board the QSO Today podcast. I'll put notes about all of the information that we discussed in the show notes page and links for the K9YA Telegraph, which is one of my favorite reads now. So with that, I want to thank you and wish you 73.
Thank you very much, Eric. It was my pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity. And it was a great experience in 73 to you. Thank you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Philip. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K9PL in the search box at the top of the page. Philip reminded me that there may be people that you know who've been interviewed by the QSO Today podcast. If that's the case, put in their call sign also at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.